Berlin at night was never truly silent during the war. Even under blackout regulations, the city breathed, boots on pavement, distant engines, the low murmur of radios behind heavy curtains. The air smelled of coal smoke, damp stone, and oil carried in from the streets. Searchlights swept slowly across the clouds, their beams fading before reaching anything solid. In this darkness, fear moved carefully, disguised as routine. Inside apartment buildings and office corridors, lights glowed briefly, then vanished. Papers were folded, radios silenced, doors locked with deliberate care. The sound of a stairwell creaking could carry too far. A knock, even an expected one, caused hesitation. In Nazi Germany, attention itself had become dangerous. Silence was safety. Somewhere within this controlled quiet, messages were being sent. Not loudly, not recklessly. They moved through invisible channels, coded notes, whispered conversations, brief encounters that left no trace. German counterintelligence would later refer to this hidden network as the Rote Kapelle, or Red Orchestra. The name implied organization, coordination, and threat. It was not chosen lightly. To the Gestapo, the danger was not sabotage or bombs, it was information. Reports about troop movements, production schedules, and strategic intentions were somehow leaving the Reich. The sources were unclear, the paths were fragmented. Every arrest seemed to reveal only another silence. The Rote Kapelle was not a single group, but a loose network of resistance and intelligence cells operating across Nazi-occupied Europe. Ordinary life continued above this unseen struggle. Civilians queued for bread, ration cards folded in careful hands, trams rattled through streets slick with rain. The smell of thin soup drifted from kitchens where windows stayed closed. People spoke cautiously, eyes lowered, voices measured. No one asked unnecessary questions. Yet the regime felt watched. Files accumulated in Gestapo offices. Names were underlined, crossed out, and written again. Interrogation rooms smelled of metal and sweat, but answers remained incomplete. By 1942, German security services believed a major intelligence network was operating inside the Reich itself. The realization unsettled even experienced officers. This was not the story of a single spy or a dramatic escape. It was something quieter, more corrosive. A network without uniforms, resistance without banners, people who did not look dangerous, yet were. The Reich was built on surveillance and fear, but now fear was turning inward. In the heart of Nazi Germany, someone was listening, and worse, someone was speaking back. How could a state built on surveillance fail to see what was happening inside its own borders? That question haunted German security services as the war deepened. The Reich had files, informants, patrols, and overlapping intelligence agencies competing to prove loyalty. Yet information continued to leak outward, quietly and persistently, without a clear source. Nazi Germany prided itself on internal control. The Gestapo operated with broad authority to monitor, arrest, and interrogate civilians suspected of dissent or espionage. Neighbors reported neighbors. Letters were opened. Telephones were tapped. Even casual remarks carried risk. And in such an environment, resistance was expected to be fragmented and short-lived. And yet, reports reaching enemy intelligence suggested something more organized. Details appeared that should have been impossible to gather without access. Military movements, production figures, strategic intentions. These were not rumors. They were accurate enough to alarm German counterintelligence, yet inconsistent enough to defy simple explanation. The mystery was not only who was responsible, but how they operated. There was no single pattern of communication. Messages did not move along one route. Arrests produced little usable information. Each suspect seemed isolated, disconnected, almost insignificant. No central headquarters was uncovered. No leader revealed. German investigators struggled with assumptions. They expected spies to look like spies, to carry codes, radios, or foreign contacts. But what if intelligence moved through ordinary routines, through conversations that sounded harmless, through paperwork handled daily without scrutiny? The idea was unsettling precisely because it challenged conventional models. Another question deepened the uncertainty. Why had the network not been destroyed earlier? German authorities believed they were dealing with multiple unrelated espionage cases rather than a coordinated system. This misinterpretation delayed recognition of scale. By the time patterns emerged, evidence had already thinned. Within civilian life, nothing obvious suggested a conspiracy. People went to work, queued for food, and returned home before curfew. Radios stayed low, windows stayed dark. Resistance, if it existed, but did not announce itself. It blended into exhaustion and routine. That invisibility was its strength. The regime's greatest advantage, fear, also became a liability. Interrogation silenced many, but it also destroyed trust between agencies. Information was hoarded, mistakes were hidden, cooperation suffered. The system that watched everyone struggled to see itself. At the center of the mystery lay a contradiction. The Reich was powerful, organized, and ruthless. Yet something inside it operated beyond reach, exchanging information without detection. The question was no longer whether such a network existed, but how deeply it penetrated everyday life, and how long it had already been there. The answers would emerge slowly through patience rather than force. And they would reveal that the most dangerous intelligence networks were not those that acted loudly, but those that learned how to disappear inside ordinary life. The places where the Rotkapelle operated were not hidden bunkers or remote safe houses. They were ordinary streets in Berlin, Brussels, and other cities under German control, apartment blocks with peeling paint, offices that smelled of paper and ink, stairwells where footsteps echoed too loudly at night. Fog gathered in courtyards. Rain darkened stone walls. Life continued under strain, but it continued. In Berlin, the capital of the Reich, daily existence was tightly regulated. Civilian rationing of food, clothing, and fuel was strictly enforced by 1941. Queues formed before dawn. Bread smelled dense and sour. People learned to keep conversations brief and neutral. Uniforms were everywhere: army gray, police green, black coats of the security services. Their presence shaped how people moved, spoke, and observed. Among these civilians were clerks, technicians, translators, and office workers, people whose work placed them near information without appearing powerful. One such civilian worked a routine administrative job, handling documents that passed through multiple departments. He was not an official of rank. He was trusted because he was unremarkable. His days followed patterns: tram rides at the same hour, lunch eaten quickly, paperwork completed without comment. Routine sharpened his awareness. Small inconsistencies stood out: a document stamped twice, a delivery logged but never received. The conversations 'twas had ended too quickly when certain names were mentioned. None of it was alarming by itself. In wartime bureaucracy, mistakes were common, but repetition suggested something else. The buildings themselves encouraged quiet observation. Corridors carried sound. Thin walls transmitted murmurs. At night, when blackout curtains sealed windows, interior noises became more pronounced. The rustle of paper, the scrape of a chair, the click of a radio dial adjusted carefully. The civilian noticed who stayed late and who avoided being seen after hours. He did not consider himself part of the resistance. Survival required neutrality. Open opposition to the Nazi regime carried severe penalties, including imprisonment or execution. Most people learned to look away, but observation did not require action. It required attention. The locations connected subtly. An office here, a private apartment there, a cafe where conversations blended into background noise. These places formed a loose web, never obvious, never fixed. Members of the Rote Kapelle often used ordinary workplaces and social settings to exchange information. Nothing about them suggested conspiracy. The civilian's role was indirect. He noticed patterns, but did not interpret them fully. He observed how certain individuals asked precise questions, remembered details too well, or avoided speaking in groups. He noticed how information moved, not openly, but through routine handling and quiet familiarity. This was the foundation of the network's strength. It did not rely on dramatic acts. It relied on people who belonged where they were. In a society trained to fear deviation, the safest cover was normality. And within that normality, information began to travel, slowly, quietly, and with consequences far beyond the streets where it first passed unnoticed. The first signs did not resemble treason. They appeared as routine irregularities, small deviations in behavior that could be explained away if viewed in isolation. A clerk who stayed late too often, a translator who asked questions beyond the needs of his assignment, a technician who lingered near offices unrelated to his duties. In a system strained by war, inefficiency was common. Intent was harder to prove. German security services relied heavily on reports from supervisors, block wardens, and informants. The Gestapo encouraged civilians to report suspicious behavior as part of the regime's internal security apparatus. These reports accumulated steadily, are most dismissed as personal grievances or misunderstandings, but a few carried a different tone, measured, factual, and persistent. In office buildings, sounds became markers: the scrape of a chair after official hours. The soft closing of a door is meant to be silent. The click of a radio dial turned quickly, then stopped. Paper smelled faintly of ink and damp air, handled more than necessary. None of this was illegal. It was merely attentive. Mail patterns require interest. Letterary S sent regularly, but never from the same location. Envelopes addressed carefully. Handwriting consistent. Content deliberately ordinary. German counterintelligence monitored postal traffic for signs of espionage, particularly foreign correspondence. Yet these letters revealed nothing overt. They were dull by design. And civilians noticed habits shaped by caution rather than comfort. Some neighbors avoided speaking even in private. Others measured words as if rehearsed. The en-ration lines, conversation stopped abruptly when uniforms passed. The smell of thin soup and boiled potatoes filled the air, but tension lingered beneath it. Fear made people observant. In cafes and waiting rooms, brief exchanges took place. A name mentioned once. A glance held too long. A pause where one was not required. These moments left no record. They passed as quickly as they appeared. But repetition gave them weight. Members of the Rote Kapelle often communicated through indirect, compartmentalized contact to avoid detection. The civilian clerk noticed how information moved without appearing to move. A report was summarized more quickly than expected. A figure known before it was officially released. A correction was made before an error was acknowledged. It suggested foreknowledge, not coincidence. Still, he said nothing. Speaking invited scrutiny. Gestapo files began to reflect unease. Suspects did not behave like traditional spies. There were no radios discovered, no ciphers seized at this stage. German investigators initially failed to recognize the Rote Kapelle as a coherent network, treating cases as isolated incidents. This misreading delayed escalation. The suspicious activities did not point to imminent action. There were no plans for sabotage, no calls for revolt. What unsettled authorities was persistence. Information leakage without violence. Resistance without noise. It suggested patience and discipline, qualities the regime respected and feared. By the time these activities were formally connected, the network had already adapted. People changed routines. Contacts shifted. Silence returned to offices and apartments that had briefly drawn attention. To most, nothing had happened. But within German security services, a quiet realization formed. Something organized was operating in plain sight, and it was proving far more difficult to expose than any open act of defiance. The investigation began without urgency, almost reluctantly. German security services were accustomed to visible enemies: communists distributing pamphlets, foreign agents using radios, dissidents speaking too openly. This case offered none of those certainties. Instead, it produced fragments, reports that felt incomplete, arrests that led nowhere, and information leaks that could not be traced to a single source. Files were opened quietly, names were written in pencil rather than ink, movements were logged over weeks, not days. The Gestapo and Sicherheitsdienst, SD, conducted long-term surveillance on suspected dissidents rather than immediate arrests when evidence was unclear. Patience replaced force, not by choice, but by necessity. Interrogations followed a familiar pattern. Questions were precise, controlled, and designed to provoke contradiction. Rooms smelled of metal furniture and stale air. Boots scraped on concrete floors. Yet answers remained consistent. Suspects denied knowledge without protest, offered plausible explanations, and avoided emotional reactions. Many individuals linked to the Rotkapelle were not professional spies, but civilians engaged in resistance and information sharing. Their lack of formal training made them harder to categorize. Investigators turned to cross-referencing. Employment records were compared against access levels. Travel permits were examined for overlaps. Social connections were mapped cautiously. A translator knew a radio technician. A clerk shared a tram route with a journalist. A pattern began to form, not hierarchical, but relational. No single leader emerged. The structure resisted definition. Civilian reports played an uneven role. Some were exaggerated, fueled by fear or rivalry. Others were precise, restrained, and repeated. These carried more weight. German counterintelligence relied heavily on civilian denunciations, though most proved unreliable. In this case, reliability came not from accusation, but from consistency. And the civilian clerk who had noticed irregular document handling was questioned informally. No accusation was made. His responses were factual, cautious. He described timing rather than intent, sequence rather than suspicion. His value lay in detail. He had seen what others ignored. Investigators noted his observations and moved on. Gradually, the investigation shifted focus. Instead of asking who was leaking information, officers asked how information could move without detection. The answer was unsettling. It moved because it belonged where it was. It passed through legitimate channels, carried by people authorized to touch it. Espionage did not require theft. It required access. By 1942, German authorities increasingly suspected a broad intelligence network rather than isolated traders. This realization changed tactics. Surveillance widened. Arrests were delayed to observe reactions. Silence became evidence. The clues were never dramatic. They were administrative, social, and procedural. A report altered too early. A conversation, was too precise. A document summarized without being requested. Each souwas suggested awareness beyond role. The investigation advanced inch by inch, hindered by its own fear of overreach. What German security services did not yet understand was that the network's strength lay in its dispersion. There was no center to strike. Each arrest risked revealing nothing and alerting everyone else. The clues were real, the investigation active, but the solution remained elusive. The Reich was learning a difficult lesson. A system built to watch everyone struggled when the threat looked like ordinary life itself. As the investigation deepened, the atmosphere inside German security offices hardened. Conversations grew shorter. Decisions were made behind closed doors. Cigarette smoke hung heavier in rooms where files were reviewed again and again. The sense of uncertainty was no longer abstract. Something was happening inside the Reich, and it was not under control. Surveillance intensified quietly. Suspects were followed at a distance, never the same way twice. Plainclothes officers noted walking routes, tram stops, cafes visited at precise hours. The Gestapo and the SD increasingly relied on layered surveillance to detect indirect contact between suspects. The goal was not arrest, but connection, to see who noticed whom and who did not. The pressure spread beyond investigators. Civilians felt it without understanding why. Uniformed patrols lingered longer at intersections. Identity checks became more frequent. The sound of boots on stairwells echoed late into the night. Bread queues fell silent when officers passed. Fear sharpened attention, but it also encouraged withdrawal. People spoke less, not more. Within the network, tension rose as well. Members sensed that the environment had changed. Conversations shortened. Meetings became rarer. Information was passed indirectly, or not at all. The Rotkapelle operated without a single command structure, relying on compartmentalization to survive pressure. That structure slowed exposure, but it also isolated individuals when danger approached. Small mistakes began to matter. A meeting delayed by minutes. A document left on a WW2 too long. A familiar face seen twice in the same week. Where randomness had once been safety. These were not failures of courage, but of exhaustion. War narrowed margins. Fatigue widened them again. German counterintelligence grew impatient. Arrests increased, often based on suspicion rather than proof. Interrogation room airs filled. The smell of metal, sweat, and damp uniforms became familiar. By late 1942, German authorities launched a broad crackdown against suspected resistance and espionage networks. The net widened, even as its shape remained unclear. The civilian clerk felt the danger indirectly. Colleagues disappeared without explanation. Desks stood empty. Files were reassigned. Questions were asked twice, then not at all. He altered his routines instinctively, arriving earlier, leaving later, speaking less. Survival demanded invisibility. Despite increased pressure, certainty remained elusive. Arrests produced confessions under duress, but these often contradicted one another. Investigators struggled to distinguish truth from coerced admission. German security services frequently misinterpreted resistance networks as centrally controlled conspiracies, leading to flawed conclusions. The tension reached a critical point when silence became more dangerous than action. For the authorities, inaction risked appearing weak. For those inside the network, movement risked exposure. The environment no longer allowed patience. Something would break, not with a single event, but through accumulation. The Reich was closing in, but it still did not understand what it was chasing. The danger was real, the pressure immense, and the margin for error nearly gone. The stage was set for discovery, not through brilliance, but through force, fear, and the inevitability of attention drawn too tightly for too long. The collapse of the network did not arrive with a single revelation. It came through accumulation. Files thickened, patterns hardened, and pressure replaced patience. German security services moved from observation to action, not because the structure was fully understood, but because uncertainty had become intolerable. In 1942 to 1943, the Gestapo initiated mass arrests connected to what it labeled the Rote Kapelle. Arrests unfolded unevenly. Doors were forced open before dawn. Boots struck stairwells with deliberate noise. Papers were seized, drawers emptied, radios dismantled whether or not they had been used. These smells of dust and damp wood-filled apartments suddenly made public. And neighbors watched in silence from behind doors that did not open. Interrogations followed swiftly. Rooms were bare and brightly lit, stripped of shadow, chairs scraped across concrete floors. Questions were repeated, reformulated, and delivered by different voices. German security services relied heavily on interrogation to extract connections, often under coercion. What emerged was not clarity, but fragments, names without context, places without timelines. The civilian clerk was summoned without warning. He walked corridors that felt unfamiliar, despite their routine. Files lay open on desks marked with red pencil. He was asked about documents, timing, access. He answered carefully, focusing on the procedure rather than the people. His observations, once peripheral, were now evidence, and he understood then how closely attention could resemble guilt. As arrests spread, the illusion of a single, unified conspiracy hardened in Gestapo thinking. German authorities believed they had uncovered a centrally directed Soviet espionage organization. This assumption simplified the investigation and distorted it. Separate groups with differing motives were forced into one narrative. Executions followed swiftly in some cases. Sentences were carried out quietly, without public explanation. Others were sent to prisons or camps, removed from circulation without record. Many individuals associated with the Rote Kapelle were executed or imprisoned by Nazi authorities. The crackdown was ruthless, intended to demonstrate control. Yet even in discovery, something remained unresolved. The arrests revealed bravery, idealism, and opposition, but they did not fully expose how information had moved so effectively. The network's true strength had been dispersion. By the time the Gestapo acted decisively, much of what it sought to stop had already happened. In German intelligence offices, the sense of victory felt incomplete. The flow of information outwards slowed, then changed shape, but certainty never arrived. Files ended in ellipses. Some questions went unanswered. Others were answered too neatly to be true. The climax, then, was not triumph. It was containment. The Reich had struck back with force, but it had done so late, and without understanding the full mechanism it had tried to destroy. The Rote Kapelle did not end with exposure. It ended with silence imposed from above. In that silence lay the final irony. The regime had proven its power to punish, but not its ability to see clearly. And by the time the network was broken, its most important work, information passed, warnings given, truth leaked, had already left the Reich behind. The true significance of the Rote Kapelle emerged only after its destruction. During the war, German authorities believed they had dismantled a powerful enemy intelligence organization. In reality, the term Rote Kapelle was a Gestapo label applied to multiple, loosely connected resistance and espionage groups. This misunderstanding shaped both the crackdown and its aftermath. From a German perspective, the outcome appeared decisive. Arrests, executions, and long prison sentences created an atmosphere of fear that temporarily reduced visible resistance. Files were closed, cases marked resolved. Reports to higher authorities emphasized success. Yet this confidence masked a deeper failure, the inability to correctly identify how intelligence had moved and why it had been so effective. For the Allies and the Soviet Union, the impact was quieter but substantial. Several Rote Kapelle networks provided valuable intelligence to Soviet military intelligence, GRU, including information about German troop movements and strategic intentions. Not all reports were perfect, and not all were acted upon, but they contributed to a broader picture of the Eastern Front at critical moments. The outcome also highlighted a structural weakness within the Nazi security state. Multiple agencies, the Gestapo, SD, and A and Beware, competed rather than cooperated. Information was hoarded. Failures were concealed. And this rivalry weakened Germany's ability to respond coherently to internal intelligence threats. The Rote Kapelle exploited this fragmentation without ever directly confronting it. For ordinary civilians involved, the consequences were severe and personal. Many had not seen themselves as spies. They believed they were sharing truth, resisting injustice, or preventing greater violence. The regime made no such distinctions. Association was enough. Guilt was assumed. Survival often depended on silence rather than innocence. Strategically, the network demonstrated that intelligence did not require centralized command to be effective. It's very loose. Cells unaware of one another, loosely motivated by different reasons, made it resilient in early stages. German investigators searched for a leader that did not exist, losing time and clarity. In the Rote Kapelle also exposed the limits of repression as a defensive tool. Fear could silence, but it could not retroactively stop information already passed. By the time executions were carried out, reports had already reached their destinations. Damage, from the regime's perspective, had already been done. In historical terms, the outcome was paradoxical. The Reich destroyed what it could see, yet failed to understand what it had faced. The network did not change the war alone, but it contributed to a larger intelligence struggle that shaped decisions beyond Germany's borders. Its significance lies not in numbers or scale, but in method. The Rote Kapelle proved that even the most controlled society could be penetrated, not by force, but by ordinary people using routine access and quiet courage, and that lesson outlasted the war itself. D. After the war, silence lingered around the Rote Kapelle. Survivors rarely spoke. Many could not. Records were incomplete, destroyed, or deliberately altered. Post-war understanding of the Rote Kapelle remained fragmented for decades. The network existed more in accusations and trial transcripts than in clear narratives. In East Germany and the Soviet Union, the story was reshaped. Some members were celebrated as anti-fascist heroes. Others were simplified into symbols that fit political needs. In the West, suspicion followed many survivors. Cold War tensions distorted memory, turning former resistors into potential liabilities rather than witnesses. The ordinary civilians who had played small roles, clerks, workers, translators, rarely received recognition. Their contribution did not fit traditional ideas of resistance. And they had not carried weapons or led uprisings. They had observed, remembered, and passed information quietly. History had little space for such acts. For intelligence historians, the Rote Kapelle became a case study in misinterpretation. German authorities' failure to correctly analyze the network remains a key example of counterintelligence error. They identified the threat, but misunderstood structure. They applied force where understanding was required. The legacy of the network lies in its ambiguity. It was not one organization, not one ideology, not one method. That ambiguity was its protection, and ultimately, its vulnerability. Once labeled, it could be hunted. Before that, it existed as fragments too ordinary to define. A modern intelligence doctrine would later emphasize lessons drawn from this case, the danger of assuming hierarchy, the value of civilian observation, and the limits of coercive interrogation. The Rote Kapelle showed that intelligence networks could exist without formal command, sustained by shared opposition rather than orders. Today, no monuments mark the apartments, offices, or stairwells where information once moved quietly through Nazi Germany. The streets look ordinary, the buildings stand unchanged, yet their history remains embedded in absence, in what was not said, not recorded, not remembered clearly. The spy network Hitler feared inside his own Reich did not survive the war intact, but its existence proved something enduring. Even under total surveillance, truth can still travel, and when it does, it rarely announces itself. It passes through routine, through ordinary people, and through moments so small they seem unimportant, until history looks back and realizes how much they mattered.